the shriek, high-pitched and laced with a terror that felt like shards of ice embedding themselves in Michael's heart, ripped through the otherwise placid late afternoon air of the Willow Creek cul-de-sac. It was Leo's shriek, not his happy yelp, not his frustrated groan, but the raw, unadulterated sound of pure distress, a sound Michael hadn't heard since Leo was a toddler and had fallen splitting his chin open on the hearth. He dropped the grocery bags he was carrying, oranges and a carton of milk, thudding onto the pristine asphalt of his driveway, his own name a ragged gasp on his lips. Leo. He sprinted towards the community green and manicured square of lawn where the neighborhood children often gathered. His son was supposed to be there under the watchful eye of a few other parents, engaging in his parallel play, perhaps lining up acorns or tracing patterns in the dirt, his own quiet way of being in the world. The scene that met Michael's eyes was a grotesque tableau, a public nightmare unfolding in sickening slow motion. Leo, his 8-year-old son, his beautiful, complicated autistic boy, stood frozen in the center of the green tears, streaming down his face, his small body trembling uncontrollably. Around his neck, secured with a rough piece of twine, hung a large, crudely lettered cardboard sign. The black marker screamed the words, "I am an HOA Rule Violator. I do not listen. I make disturbing noises." And standing before him, arms crossed, face a mask of smug, righteous indignation, was Ms. Henrietta Holloway, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association. A small knot of other children stood by, some confused, some snickering, nervously a few parents hovering uncertainly at the periphery, their expressions ranging from discomfort to thinly veiled approval. "Let this be a lesson to all of you." Ms. Holloway was proclaiming, her voice sharp and carrying, oblivious or indifferent to Leo's escalating distress. Willow Creek has standards. We will not tolerate disruptive behavior. We will not tolerate defiance of our community guidelines. This young man, she gestured towards Leo with a contemptuous flick of her wrist, repeatedly ignores verbal warnings. Perhaps a more public acknowledgement of his transgressions will encourage compliance. Michael felt a surge of adrenaline so potent it left a metallic taste in his mouth, a blinding white rage that threatened to consume his carefully cultivated professional composure. This wasn't just an HOA dispute. This wasn't just a neighborhood Karen on a power trip. This was a targeted, cruel public humiliation of his vulnerable child. This was abuse. His mind, the mind of Commander Michael Harrison, head of the Oak Haven Police Department's Special Victims Division, began cataloging offenses with chilling clarity, even as the father in him wanted to tear Ms. Holloway apart with his bare hands. Psychological abuse of a minor, public shaming of a disabled individual, unlawful restraint. He was moving before he consciously registered the decision, covering the distance to his son in a few long strides. The other parents, the other children, even Ms. Holloway, seemed to fade into an insignificant blur. All he saw was Leo, his wide, terrified eyes fixed on Michael, a silent plea for rescue. "Leo Michael," said his voice, surprisingly gentle, a stark contrast to the inferno raging within him. He knelt before his son, carefully, tenderly, untying the twine and removing the offensive sign. Leo collapsed into his arms, burying his face in Michael's shoulder, his small body racked with a fresh wave of sobs, the kind that came from a place of deep psychic wounding. Michael held him tight, murmuring reassurances, his own heart aching, with a pain so profound it was almost physical. He could feel the dampness of Leo's tears soaking through his shirt. Over Leo's trembling shoulder, he met Ms. Holloway's gaze. Her smugness had faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of surprise, perhaps even a hint of apprehension, as she registered the sheer, unadulterated fury in Michael's eyes. But it was quickly replaced by her customary arrogance. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice regaining its sharp edge, "I understand you're upset, but your son was—" "Be silent, Ms. Holloway." Michael cut her off, his voice low, dangerously quiet, yet carrying an authority that made several of the onlookers take an involuntary step back. "You will not speak another word about my son. You will not speak another word at all until I instruct you to do so." He rose to his full height, Leo still cradled protectively in his arms. The father was in control now, but the commander was already planning his next move. Ms. Holloway had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She had no idea who she had just declared war on. Michael and Leo lived a relatively quiet life in Willow Creek. After his wife Sarah had passed away from a sudden illness 3 years prior, Michael had thrown himself into his work and into caring for Leo. His job, as he usually described it to casual acquaintances, involved sensitive casework within the police department, a deliberately vague description that shielded both him and Leo from the often grim realities of his daily responsibilities. Only his closest friends and family knew he was the commander of the Special Victims Division, a role that exposed him to the darkest corners of human behavior, but also fueled his unwavering commitment to protecting the vulnerable. Leo was the center of his universe. Diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder at age 3, Leo experienced the world in a way that was uniquely his own. He was a bright, affectionate boy with an encyclopedic knowledge of dinosaurs and a talent for drawing intricate, fantastical creatures. He also had his challenges. Sensory sensitivities meant that loud noises, bright lights, or certain textures could be overwhelming. Social interactions were often confusing for him, and he relied heavily on routine and predictability. When anxious or excited, he would sometimes hum softly or flap his hands, small self-soothing behaviors that Michael understood and cherished as part of who Leo was. Willow Creek, with its tree-lined streets, its well-regarded elementary school, and its reputation as a safe, family-friendly community, had seemed like the perfect place for them to rebuild their lives after Sarah's death. Michael had bought a modest ranch house on a quiet cul-de-sac, hoping Leo could thrive in the peaceful environment. For a while, it had been just that. Leo had made tentative progress at school, and he enjoyed his walks through the neighborhood, meticulously observing the patterns of leaves on the trees, the flight paths of birds, the cracks in the sidewalk. Their first significant encounter with Ms. Henrietta Holloway had occurred a few months after they moved in. Ms. Holloway, a woman whose perfectly coiffed silver hair and impeccably tailored pantsuits seemed to serve as armor for her rigid, unyielding personality, had accosted Michael during one of his walks with Leo. Leo, in a moment of joyful exuberance, had let out a series of loud, happy squeals as he chased a butterfly that had strayed onto the edge of Ms. Holloway's immaculate astroturf-like lawn. Mr. Harrison, Ms. Holloway, had set her voice like a disapproving icicle. "I must request that you keep your son under better control. This is a tranquil community. Such outbursts are not conducive to the peaceful enjoyment of our properties." Michael had been taken aback by her hostility, but had tried to be diplomatic. "I apologize if Leo disturbed you, Ms. Holloway. He has autism, and sometimes he expresses his excitement a bit loudly. He meant no harm." Ms. Holloway's eyes, the color of glacial ice, had narrowed. "Autism is not a license to disregard community standards, Mr. Harrison. We have rules here for a reason. Perhaps you should review your HOA handbook." With that, she had turned on her heel and marched back into her perfectly ordered, perfectly silent house. That encounter had been a harbinger of things to come. Ms. Holloway, it turned out, was not just an HOA president. She was a self-appointed guardian of conformity, a petty tyrant who wielded the HOA bylaws like a weapon targeting anyone or anything that deviated from her narrow definition of acceptability. And Leo, with his innocent, unself-conscious expressions of his unique neurotype, quickly became her prime target. The inciting incident, the first formal salvo in Ms. Holloway's escalating war against his son, arrived via certified mail a few weeks later. It was an official HOA warning, typed on heavy embossed letterhead, citing a litany of Leo's supposed violations. His repetitive and disruptive vocalizations during his walks, his erratic and unpredictable movements near the community flower beds. Leo liked to trace the outline of the petals with his fingers. His failure to maintain appropriate social distancing. Leo, in his innocence, had once tried to show Ms. Holloway a particularly interesting beetle he'd found getting closer than her comfort zone apparently allowed. The letter concluded with a demand that Michael take immediate steps to rectify his son's behavioral issues or face fines and potential restrictions on Leo's access to common areas. Michael had been livid. He'd immediately requested a meeting with Ms. Holloway and the HOA board. He'd brought documentation from Leo's developmental pediatrician and his occupational therapist, explaining the nature of autism, explaining that Leo's behaviors were not acts of defiance, but manifestations of his neurodivergence. He'd spoken passionately about Leo's right to exist in the community, his right to enjoy the same amenities as any other child. The board members, a collection of mostly older, well-meaning, but clearly intimidated individuals, had listened with varying degrees of sympathy. But Ms. Holloway had been implacable. "Mr. Harrison," she'd said, her voice dripping with condescension, "while I appreciate your parental advocacy, the fact remains that your son's behaviors are a source of discomfort and concern to other residents. This is not a therapeutic institution. It is a residential community with established norms. If Leo cannot adhere to those norms, then perhaps Willow Creek is not the appropriate environment for him." Her implication had been clear: get your son in line or get out. The rising action of Ms. Holloway's campaign had been insidious and relentless. She began to follow Michael and Leo on their walks, her presence a palpable weight, her eyes like a hawk's, constantly scanning for any perceived infraction. She'd take notes on a small pad, sometimes even raising her phone, as if to take pictures, a clear act of intimidation. She started lobbying the HOA board for new, increasingly specific and restrictive rules, all clearly designed to target Leo. No persistent humming or rhythmic vocalizations in common areas. All children must maintain a direct and undeviating path on designated walkways. Use of community green space, restricted to organized and supervised quiet play only. Each new rule was a fresh assault, another tightening of the net around Leo. She also began a subtle campaign of misinformation among other residents, particularly newer families who didn't know Michael or Leo well. She'd speak in hushed, concerned tones about Leo's unpredictability, his lack of boundaries, hinting that he might be a safety risk to other children. Some parents, influenced by her authoritative demeanor and her position as HOA president, began to steer their own children away from Leo, their polite smiles barely masking their unease. Leo, keenly sensitive to social cues despite his difficulties in interpreting them, felt the isolation, his already fragile confidence eroding. The first truly shocking escalation, the one that moved beyond petty rulemaking into active malicious deprivation, occurred during the annual Willow Creek Easter egg hunt. Leo loved Easter egg hunts. The bright colors, the thrill of discovery, the predictable pattern of searching. It was an activity that resonated deeply with his autistic sensibilities. Michael had prepared him carefully, walking him through what to expect, practicing how to pick up the eggs gently. But as they arrived at the community park, Ms. Holloway had stepped forward, blocking their path. "I'm afraid Leo will not be able to participate this year. Mr. Harrison," she'd announced, her voice cool and firm, loud enough for several other families to hear. Michael had been stunned. "What, why not?" "Several residents have expressed concerns," she'd said, her gaze sweeping dismissively over Leo, who had started to hum anxiously, sensing the tension. Given Leo's particular behaviors, his tendency towards overexcitement and his difficulty in following structured rules, it's felt that his participation might be disruptive and unfair to the other children who are capable of following instructions. It was a blatant, cruel lie. Leo was gentle, and he understood rules perfectly well when they were explained clearly. This was a deliberate act of exclusion designed to punish Leo and humiliate Michael. Leo, understanding the rejection, even if he didn't grasp the complex adult malice behind it, had burst into tears, his dreams of colorful eggs and chocolate bunnies dissolving into a public spectacle of his own perceived inadequacy. Michael, his heart breaking for his son, had picked him up and carried him home, the sound of other children's laughter, a bitter counterpoint to Leo's heartbroken sobs. The incident had left a deep scar on both of them. Ms. Holloway had successfully deprived his son of a simple childhood joy solely because of his disability. The second shocking detail, the one that directly precipitated the horror on the community green, involved Ms. Holloway's escalating obsession with order and her increasingly unhinged reactions to Leo's harmless autistic traits. Leo had a particular fondness for the small decorative gravel path that wound through the community rose garden. He loved the crunching sound the gravel made under his shoes, the way the different colored stones formed patterns. Sometimes, if a particular rose caught his attention, he would step a few inches off the path onto the soft bark mulch to get a closer look, to gently touch a petal or inhale its fragrance. He never harmed the plants. He was meticulous and respectful. Ms. Holloway, however, had declared the rose garden a sacred space of tranquil contemplation, and any deviation from the designated path was in her eyes an act of vandalism. She had installed small, almost invisible tripwires along the edge of the path and had taken to hiding behind a large rhododendron bush, waiting to catch Leo in the act of stepping onto the mulch. One afternoon, Leo, engrossed in observing a ladybug on a rose petal, had inadvertently triggered one of her tripwires. Ms. Holloway had burst from her hiding place, screaming at him, accusing him of willful destruction of HOA property and deliberate defiance. Leo, terrified by her sudden appearance and her aggressive shouting, had had a full-blown sensory meltdown, dropping to the ground, covering his ears, and rocking back and forth, overwhelmed and unable to process her onslaught. Ms. Holloway, instead of showing a shred of compassion or understanding, had interpreted his meltdown as further evidence of his uncontrollable nature. She had photographed him in his distress, later presenting the pictures to the HOA board as proof of his dangerous instability. It was this incident Michael later pieced together that had pushed Ms. Holloway over the edge, leading her to concoct her monstrous plan of public shaming with the HOA Rule Violator sign. She had likely prepared the sign in advance, waiting for what she deemed the next inevitable transgression. And now that transgression had occurred in her twisted perception. Back on the community green, after Michael had tenderly removed the sign from Leo's neck and gathered his sobbing son into his arms, he turned his full attention to Ms. Holloway. The other parents and children had begun to disperse, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, the dangerous undercurrent in Michael's controlled demeanor. Ms. Holloway. Michael said, his voice still quiet, but now imbued with a steely authority that brooked no argument. "You will remain here. Do not attempt to leave." He pulled out his phone, Leo still clinging to him, his small body a constant trembling reminder of the outrage that had been committed. He dialed a number he knew by heart. "This is Commander Harrison Special Victims Division," he said into the phone, his eyes never leaving Ms. Holloway's now genuinely alarmed face. "I need a patrol unit and a detective dispatched to my location." "Willow Creek Community Green, immediately. I have a situation involving the abuse of a disabled minor. The perpetrator is on scene." He provided a brief, concise summary of what had occurred, his language precise, professional, chillingly detached. The color drained from Ms. Holloway's face. "Commander Harrison, Special Victims Division." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence of the green. The full import of what she had done, the true identity of the man whose child she had so cruelly targeted, was beginning to dawn on her with horrifying clarity. She wasn't dealing with just another disgruntled resident she could bully into submission with her HOA rulebook. She had, in her arrogance and her malice, crossed a line into criminal behavior, and she had done it to the son of a man whose entire professional life was dedicated to bringing people like her to justice. The midpoint twist was not a revelation of a hidden accomplice or a secret motive beyond Holloway's apparent need for control and her prejudice. It was the stark public unveiling of Michael's professional identity and the immediate, irreversible shift in power that accompanied it. Ms. Holloway had thought she was the one in control, the enforcer of rules. Now she was about to become the subject of a criminal investigation initiated and overseen by the very man she had victimized. As Michael ended the call, he saw the first flicker of genuine panic in Ms. Holloway's eyes. She opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to apologize, perhaps to try and talk her way out of the rapidly closing net. But Michael cut her off with a single cold glance. "Save it, Ms. Holloway. You'll have plenty of opportunity to explain your actions to the detectives." He then turned his attention back to Leo, gently stroking his hair, murmuring soothing words, trying to bring his son back from the precipice of terror and humiliation. He knew the road ahead would be long and difficult. The emotional scars inflicted on Leo today would not heal easily. But as he held his son, a fierce, protective resolve solidified within him. He would use every resource at his disposal, every ounce of his professional knowledge and authority, to ensure that Henrietta Holloway faced the full consequences of her actions. The fight for Leo's dignity, for his right to be himself without fear of persecution, had just begun, and Commander Michael Harrison was uniquely terrifyingly equipped to win it. The arrival of the patrol car, its lights casting a stark official glow in the fading afternoon light, marked the formal beginning of Ms. Holloway's downfall. Two uniformed officers, young, serious, and clearly briefed on the nature of the call, approached Michael. He recognized one of them, Officer Davies, a recent academy graduate he'd given a guest lecture to on interacting with vulnerable victims. "Commander Harrison," Sir Davies said, his voice respectful, his eyes taking in the scene. Michael holding a clearly distressed Leo, the discarded sign lying on the grass like a piece of toxic refuse, and Ms. Holloway standing stiffly by her face, a mask of pale apprehension. Officer Davies Michael acknowledged his voice regaining some of its professional cadence. Thank you for the rapid response. The perpetrator is Ms. Henrietta Holloway, resident of this community and president of the Homeowners Association. He gestured towards her with a curt nod. She is responsible for placing this sign on my 8-year-old autistic son Leo and publicly shaming him. While one officer began to speak with Ms. Holloway, advising her of her rights, Officer Davies knelt down, trying to engage Leo in a gentle, non-threatening way. Michael appreciated the effort, though Leo was still largely unresponsive, buried deep in his own world of distress. Detective Miller, a seasoned investigator from the SVD, Michael's own division, arrived a few minutes later, his expression grim as Michael recounted the events. Psychological abuse of a disabled minor, Commander Miller said, shaking his head, his voice low so Leo wouldn't overhear. Clear as day, and the public humiliation aspect, that's just sadistic. We'll need to take statements from everyone who witnessed this, and that sign is crucial evidence. He carefully bagged the cardboard sign, his movements precise, methodical. Ms. Holloway by this point had found her voice again, though it was laced with a tremor of fear rather than her usual arrogance. She began to protest, loudly claiming it was all a misunderstanding, that she was merely trying to enforce community rules, that Leo was an unruly child, and Michael was overreacting and using his position to intimidate her. Michael listened impassively, his face unreadable. When she finally paused for breath, he spoke, his voice cold and devoid of inflection. Ms. Holloway, your attempts to justify your actions are noted. However, the evidence, including multiple eyewitnesses, and the physical sign itself, indicates a deliberate and malicious act of psychological abuse against a vulnerable child. You will be transported to the precinct for formal questioning. I strongly advise you to contact an attorney. The climax of this particular act in the unfolding drama was not a dramatic chase or a violent struggle. It was the quiet, methodical dismantling of Ms. Holloway's authority, the public stripping away of her self-proclaimed righteousness. As Detective Miller formally placed her under arrest, reading her Miranda rights in a clear, unequivocal voice, several neighbors who had witnessed the entire exchange gasped. A few who had perhaps harbored their own grievances against Ms. Holloway but had been too intimidated to speak out, now looked on with a mixture of shock and dawning relief. The Queen Bee of Willow Creek, the iron-fisted ruler of their small suburban kingdom, was being led away in handcuffs, her face a mixture of disbelief, fury, and a dawning, terrible understanding of the gravity of her situation. The charge Miller announced clearly for all to hear was felony injury to a child, specifically emotional and psychological abuse, and related misdemeanors including unlawful restraint and public nuisance. As the police car pulled away, taking a sputtering, still protesting Ms. Holloway with it, a strange quiet descended upon the community green. The other children had long since been ushered home by their parents, many of whom now looked at Michael with a new complex mixture of awe-sympathy and perhaps a little fear. He was no longer just Leo's quiet, polite father. He was Commander Harrison, a man who wielded a different kind of authority, one that far surpassed the petty tyranny of an HOA president. The falling action began almost immediately. The HOA board convened an emergency meeting that very night, the remaining members in a state of shock and disarray. Faced with the undeniable reality of their president's arrest and the horrific nature of her actions, they had little choice. Ms. Holloway was immediately suspended from her duties, and steps were initiated for her permanent removal. The news of the arrest and the details of the sign incident spread through Willow Creek like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of outraged recrimination, and for some, a long overdue reckoning. For Michael and Leo, the days that followed were difficult. Leo was traumatized, his routines shattered, his trust in the safety of his own neighborhood violated. He had nightmares, became withdrawn, and refused to leave the house for several days. Michael took time off work, dedicating himself entirely to Leo's care. He arranged for emergency sessions with Leo's therapist, Dr. Evans, a compassionate and skilled child psychologist who specialized in autism. Dr. Evans worked gently with Leo, helping him to process his feelings of fear, shame, and confusion, using play therapy and social stories to help him understand that what Ms. Holloway had done was wrong, that it was not his fault, and that he was safe and loved. Michael, meanwhile, navigated the complexities of the legal case against Ms. Holloway with a grim determination. He provided a detailed statement, not just as a father, but as an expert in child abuse investigations. He ensured that all witness statements were collected, that the evidence was meticulously preserved. He liaised with the district attorney's office, advocating for the strongest possible charges, emphasizing the vulnerability of the victim and the calculated cruelty of the perpetrator. His professional reputation, his deep knowledge of the law, and his unwavering commitment to justice for his son lent an undeniable weight to the prosecution's case. The community of Willow Creek was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Ms. Holloway's reign of terror had not occurred in a vacuum. Many residents, while perhaps not actively malicious, had been complicit in their silence, intimidated by her, or unwilling to challenge her increasingly erratic behavior. Now faced with the stark reality of her arrest, a wave of shame and regret swept through the neighborhood. Some residents reached out to Michael, offering apology, support, and offers of help. Others, who had been more openly supportive of Ms. Holloway, now found themselves ostracized, their own judgment called into question. The HOA board, leaderless and discredited, struggled to pick up the pieces. They issued a formal public apology to Michael and Leo, acknowledging the association's failure to protect a vulnerable member of their community. They pledged to undertake a complete review of their bylaws, to implement mandatory sensitivity and disability awareness training for all board members, and to create a more inclusive and welcoming environment. The reign of arbitrary punitive rulemaking was over. Ms. Holloway's legal battle was short and brutal. Faced with irrefutable evidence, including the damning testimony of multiple eyewitnesses, the photographic evidence of the sign and Leo's distress, and the expert opinion of Dr. Evans on the psychological damage inflicted, her high-priced lawyer quickly realized the futility of a trial. She eventually pleaded no contest to a reduced felony charge of child endangerment involving psychological abuse and a misdemeanor charge of false imprisonment. The judge, clearly moved by the victim impact statement Michael read on Leo's behalf. Leo himself was deemed too vulnerable to testify directly, though he did provide a statement to Dr. Evans in a therapeutic setting, sentenced Ms. Holloway to 1 year in county jail, followed by 5 years of intensive probation. The sentence included mandatory psychological counseling, anger management therapy, and a permanent restraining order, barring her from any contact with Michael or Leo, or from residing within a 5-mile radius of their home. She was also ordered to pay a substantial fine and restitution to cover the costs of Leo's therapy. Her house in Willow Creek was sold to cover her mounting legal fees and the court-ordered payments her life in the community she had once ruled with an iron fist reduced to ashes. The resolution was not just about Ms. Holloway's punishment, it was about Leo's healing and the community's transformation. Slowly, with the unwavering support of his father, his therapist, and a newly awakened and compassionate neighborhood, Leo began to recover. The nightmares faded. He started venturing outside again, at first just into their own backyard, then tentatively for short walks with Michael. Neighbors who had once avoided him now greeted him with warm smiles and kind words. Children who had been confused or scared now approached him with genuine curiosity and acceptance. The elementary school, in collaboration with Dr. Evans, implemented an autism awareness program helping other students to understand and appreciate neurodiversity. One Saturday morning, months after Ms. Holloway's sentencing, the Willow Creek community held a Welcome Back Leo fair on the very green where he had been so cruelly shamed. There were games face, painting a quiet zone with sensory activities, and a table laden with information about autism acceptance. Leo, holding Michael's hand, walked through the fair, his initial apprehension slowly giving way to a shy smile as he saw the outpouring of genuine warmth and support. He even participated in a dinosaur-themed craft activity his earlier joy in his special interest rekindled. Later that afternoon, as Michael pushed Leo on the swings, watching him soar, a genuine, unforced laugh bubbling up from his son's chest, he felt a profound sense of peace. The fight had been harrowing, the emotional cost immense, but they had emerged stronger, both as individuals and as a community. Ms. Holloway's malice had paradoxically been the catalyst for a profound positive change. Willow Creek was no longer a place of rigid conformity and silent fear. It had become a community that was learning to embrace difference, to champion and vulnerable, and to celebrate the unique gifts of every individual. Michael knew the memory of that terrible afternoon would never entirely fade, but it would no longer be defined by pain and humiliation. It would be a reminder of a father's fierce love, a community's capacity for redemption, and the enduring power of justice to heal even the deepest wounds. Leo, his resilient, extraordinary son, was laughing again, his spirit, though battered unbroken. And in that sound, Michael heard the invulnerable, undeniable triumph of light over in darkness. The sign was gone, replaced by 1,000 small acts of kindness, a testament to the enduring strength of the human heart.